Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedules and join us in a webcast with Francis McInerney. Francis, I would trust that you will actually introduce yourself in a minute. I just want to say that Dr. Günther Jauch and myself, who are partners, are extremely happy that we got the opportunity to have Francis McInerney in a webcast with us and use his Future Creators methodology of information velocity to give us much more insights into the transaction between Amazon and Whole Foods market. Very briefly to me and who I am, my name is Tom Kessler. Many of the people that are on the webcast do know me. I have spent the last 27 years in pre and post merger integration, managed pretty much everything from in the corporate finance spectrum, from acquisitions to mergers to divestitures to joint ventures to equity investments, and enjoyed an interesting ride in North America, in Europe, as well as in Asia, where I did deals, particularly also in Australia. I typically specialize in synergies in managing large and mid-size transactions for mid-size companies to larger companies, and have really kind of enjoyed that for the last couple of years and have a big, huge repository of stories that I could tell or could talk about, but this is not the venue to do that. I would like to briefly hand over to Günther, Dr. Günther Jauch from Winning Business Models, and then over to you, Francis. Günther.
So I'm Günther Jauch. I'm based in Austria, and I was primarily engaged in the last years in performance improvement and company-wide transformation projects, and I have some similarities to Thomas, and I think we will enjoy together the webinar with Francis.
Great. Thank you very much. So you want me to start now, Thomas?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, great. I'm Francis McInerney, and this Future Creators program is part of our North River Ventures operation. I started a company in 1976 in Toronto doing industrial market research in the telecommunications area and learned an enormous amount about information, the structure of that industry, and how it works. And built that company up, moved it to New York, and sold it to McGraw-Hill, what had become the largest market research house in the telecommunications sector worldwide. Since then, I've been invited by many of the world's largest companies to join them to help them figure out how to understand the information age, what to do, what strategies work. I've been also involved in venture capital in the United States, private equity in Europe. And indeed, I am European. I'm born outside London. With Brexit, I don't know how much longer I can say I'm European, but there you go. So I would like to give you here an overview. This is our comprehensive system for managing at zettabyte scale, which is the information space in which we currently exist. I want to use the example here of Amazon and Whole Foods. And I want to pick up on something that those of you who know Thomas and Günther understand, which is pre-merger integration. The more you pre-merge, the more you work on understanding the simple elements of post-merger integration, the problems you may and may not have. So with these two companies, I've discovered some fascinating information. You're going to learn an awful lot. And I think we should start with the conventional wisdom on mergers and acquisitions. You target your deal, you cut costs, and you've got value creation. And we see this kind of simple approach all over the world all the time. And we all know a very high % of these deals collapse. And what we want to understand is why. Why do so many companies do so many deals and so many deals fail? Well, our insight is this. It's the information velocity of a company that tells us everything we need to know. If we understand the information velocity, and I'll explain that as we move forward, you understand everything. And if you acquire without having a top speed information velocity first, you're going to have problems. First of all, it's the information velocity that allows you to know what to buy, why, or even how to make a deal accretive. And if you don't have the information velocity, you'll never understand how to do those things, simply because information velocity, well, it gives you information. And Amazon's data, this is where it gets fascinating, because Amazon is meant to be the big, high-growth, high-value company. It doesn't appear to understand what its information velocity is. That's what the data show us, and I'll show you. And it doesn't seem to understand how to accelerate its information velocity to merger and acquisition speeds. Amazon, in effect, in my findings, doesn't know how to make M&A accretive. And this is a big, in a sense, it's a big shock. I say, well, good luck with that. Now, let's try to understand how information velocity adds value and what information velocity is. I'm going to show you a really simple set of data here. Now, everyone knows what days of sales and inventories and days of sales and accounts receivable are. And traditionally, the more you had in both, the more you put in payables to cover the two of them. Well, what we discovered was something else entirely. And that is that, in effect, these two numbers added together show how fast information moves from a company through its supply chain to its customers in a form of value. And if this number is big, we've discovered all kinds of problems with information. And let's look at this. A company with a lot of days of sales has a low information velocity. It has all these cash wait states. I put them here as the little blank spaces on the dashed line. And a cash wait state could be, inventory sitting in a truck. It could be sitting in a rail yard, something in a warehouse, something that's just not moving. And what Walmart discovered about 24 or 5 years ago, and Apple made a top case of, is that if you have the right information technology to close those wait states up, you accelerate information through your system, and that provides a ton of wonderful extra benefits. Now, what you have here in this low information velocity world is, as I mentioned, information going from the customer through the supply chain back to your customer is slow. In addition, what we've discovered is that information losses are high. So you have an information time problem, customer information time. The picture is not good. Generally, cash conversion is slow and hard. It's not something that's easy to do because getting customer information into cash in an environment like this is structurally difficult. And time again, we find in all the companies we work on that value added is minimal simply because the customer information time problem is so big. Now, if we were to shorten these wait states, we end up with a really different picture. We end up with high information velocity. So I tell everyone, you add the two days, you add the days of sales and inventory, days of sales and receivable, that is your information velocity. Simple number. If you have 50 in inventories and 60 in receivables, it's 110. If you're like Apple and the total's around 35, that's a big difference. And if you were to go to Japan, where I spent rather a lot of time in the last 30 years, you'll see time and again, these numbers are big, information velocity is slow. And if you look at the value on the Japanese stock market today, it's roughly 50% of where it was in December 1989, when the Dow was 2606, which is kind of like saying the Dow would be around 1300 today. That is the loss of value from misunderstanding all of this data. Now, what you end up with is a customer information surplus because the information goes from the customer through your supply chain and back to the customer very fast. And your losses are minimal. They're absolutely minimal. And cash conversion becomes much, much easier to do. And value added because of the information flow, it literally self-optimizes. And this really is the mission of ERP and IT. It's information velocity acceleration in order to solve the customer information time problem. Now, this is a completely different way of looking at a balance sheet. It is not traditional at all. What it simply says is that, look, buried in our inventories and receivables is time and also customer information. If we have too many, we have too much time and too little information, and we can't act on it effectively, we can't act on it quickly, we can't get the job done. And this fairly simple structure explains why you have your Apples and Walmarts on one side of the equation and so many other companies on the other side, because they're not putting in the IT. When you go to an Apple store and you check out and the person helping you swipes your card on their iPhone, what's actually happening is that the entire supply chain worldwide is being lit up through Apple's ERP. It's a single instance structure globally. Now, these huge information time advantages accrue, and they accrue quickly. But what it means, and this is critical when you're thinking of M&A or anything else, is that everything is a subset of information velocity acceleration. If you think about this chart for more than a few minutes, you realize, oh, you know what? If we are on the top and we try to sell to customers who are in the minimized state, we don't even know how to add value for them. So you have profound asymmetries just in sales. Today, we're going to look at this as an M&A deal. If you're on the top line and you try to acquire someone on the bottom line with minimal weight states, you're creating all kinds of problems. And these problems can last for years and years and years. And there is one story we've been tracking over the years. It's 20 years now. It's been going on, and it's just a disaster. So anyway, let's look at what our data show. Our data show that Amazon's information velocity was way slower than Whole Foods. Now that's a surprise. Amazon, the home of AWS, is slower even than Walmart's. That's a real surprise. Walmart is bricks and mortar stores. And the big problem, as you'll see, is in payables, which suggests supply chain management issues. If you have to mask your slow information velocity with a lot of payables, something isn't working somewhere and you're using payables to mask operational failure. And the question that this brings up is, can the home of Amazon Web Services have ERP problems? Sounds nuts, but the data are clear. It sounds nuts, but the numbers are the numbers. Then my question is management reading its own annual reports? You know, we were tracking what happened with Sears over 20 years, and Sears did nothing, absolutely zero, to fix these data. And it was easy to predict a decade ago, more, that Sears was going to go under, and guess what? Sears went under. So the point here is that Amazon may not have the information to know how to make a Whole Foods deal accretive. Let's just look at some of this. Here are the straight information velocity data of 3 companies. You have Amazon, Walmart, and Whole Foods. Now, less is faster, as I noted earlier. Look at the Whole Foods line. That's the sum of inventory days and receivables. Now look at the Walmart line. It's quite a bit bigger, but look at Amazon. It's way up there. Now, this tells us that the asymmetry I mentioned in that first big graphic is operating here on this deal. And that suggests to me serious problems that are not immediately obvious to the observer. You'd have to dig in this space to find out, well, let's just look at Amazon's ERP. And what are they doing? Because this says without a doubt that Whole Foods system was incomparably superior. And to have a Walmart outperforming Amazon, that's very, very interesting to my way of thinking. Now, let's look at Amazon's core efficiencies. Here you have, on the bottom, days of sales and inventory. Now, most retailers, and you'll see this in a second, days of sales in receivables are usually around 5 days because everything just goes out of cash register. There's not really a big receivables number. This is a lot more than 5 days. And the other thing I find interesting is that it doesn't seem to have changed very much. It's not like management's been acting on this. And days of sales and inventory. Again, management isn't acting. There's no clear sudden dip in the numbers that shows you that, there was a big board meeting 3 years ago and everyone decided they had to take action to straighten this out. But look at the payables line. This tells me that Amazon works because its suppliers are bankers. And when your suppliers are your bankers instead of your suppliers, this raises big questions. The first thing I do when I go into a company and I see something like this is I dig really hard into deeper operational questions because I know you just don't have to do this. If you were to look at a Walmart, the first thing you would see is that it's been trying to strengthen its suppliers. And especially in the 2008-9 crash, they shortened payables up very quickly in order to prevent suppliers having problems. And that's because they had the information with which to do it. That's a profound difference in thinking. Amazon's suppliers are banks, pure and simple. Now, let's look at days of sales and inventory and just compare the two companies, Amazon and the company it acquired. These numbers are way out of sync with one another. It's just an astonishingly big difference. How could you have a company with 35 days, 30 days of sales and inventory trying to buy a company with 10 or 11 and expect that whatever system they were using would somehow add value to the acquisition? Now, it is possible, and it has been done, but it's rare that the acquired company ports its ERP and IT systems onto the acquirer. It does happen. It is rare. It's very, very difficult to do. And most of the management in the acquiring company would probably have to go because they wouldn't have the expertise to understand the transition. And that is another problem, because if you go back to that early graphic I did with the information velocities, the human resource requirement for the faster company is entirely different from the human resource requirement for the slower one. So you not only have M&A, sales, human resources. We could go through a very long list. Organization structures would be asymmetric with respect to one another. There are a lot of questions that get raised by these data. Now let's look at receivables. Again, here you have Whole Foods with the typical days of sales and receivables. And we do have something mislabeled here. It says Amazon days of COGS and receivables, 3 days of sales. And as you see, it's a much larger number, and it's been rising. So this raises other questions. Now, let's look at days of sales in payables. We see that Whole Foods pays its supply chain pretty quickly. And that's a pretty nice number for Whole Foods suppliers, and you want to be a Whole Foods supplier looking at these data. But look at Amazon. The difference is really big. And it shows a way of thinking that is completely unlike Whole Foods. And what I find odd and mysterious is that Amazon, in its 10K filing, which is a Securities and Exchange filing that it builds into its annual report, actually has a section where it brags about its ability to manage its inventory, so it shouldn't have this problem. Well, it does have the problem, and here are the data. The data are really frighteningly clear. Now, what is the price of Amazon's information velocity here? First of all, the interesting thing is that Amazon had 18 days of sales in accounts receivable when it acquired Whole Foods. Whole Foods had 5. Walmart had 4. There's something wrong here. How can this be? This makes no sense to me at all. Amazon had 105 days of COGS in payables. Walmart had 39. These are staggering operational differences. And Whole Foods had only 11, as we saw in that earlier chart. This is raising for me big questions about what is actually going on here. And from Amazon's information velocity is slow. Its supply chain management is inferior. Now, there's another interesting thing here, and we have to address this. On page 24 and 25 of Amazon's 10K, it shows there clearly that Amazon itself loses money. All of its profit, roughly 106% of its operating profit, comes from Amazon Web Services. So Amazon itself, looking at this operational data, then looking at its operating margins, when I say its supply chain management system is inferior, I think a lot of what they're doing is inferior. And I've put a full-length video on the website, showing the costs in detail. This can only detract from the value of Whole Foods. There just isn't a way with these asymmetries that this is a deal that somehow adds huge amounts of value. It appears to me that the value engine in Amazon is Amazon Web Services. And if you take that away, you don't have a particularly interesting company at all. So let's think about the price Amazon pays. The gap between Amazon's information velocity and Whole Foods is about $18 billion. That's a lot of money. Operating margins, as I mentioned, it's half of Whole Foods. That's not very good. It's half of Walmart's. And as I said, Amazon Web Services is 106% of operating profits. That is a staggering number. That's not what I expected to find when I started going through their 10K and thinking about this. So Amazon is doing M&A deals without information velocity mapping. You know, if all they did was map information velocity, to go back, as I mentioned earlier, to what Thomas and Gunther always say, you get to do pre-merger integration. You get to identify tons and tons of questions for going through this deal well before you merge to understand where the risks, post-merger risks will be and neutralize them. And that's what smart companies do. So the information velocity management system is critical. What is Amazon thinking? This is what I am amazed why would you do an M&A deal without an information velocity management system in place? I find this very, very hard to understand. And it raises many, many questions in my mind. The biggest is, well, where do Whole Foods customers fit in all this? There are already stories in the media about problems in Whole Foods stores, problems with suppliers, problems with staff. None of this is surprising because of the information in what we have in the foregoing. So we've been doing this since 1976. I have to say, we've seen just about everything, some of it really ugly, seen some great stuff too. And with that, Thomas, I'd like to open this for questions.
Francis, how did you find out that Amazon has some problems in the supply chain?
Very simply by looking at these data and comparing them to the other companies. When you look at the data and you see numbers like this, it tells you that something is not right. Now, the question we all have is what, because we don't know. I'm not an advisor to Amazon, so I haven't the slightest idea. But it does tell me that if I was going in there, it's the first thing I would look at, supply chain problems. Now, they have a very complicated system for products, some of which they warehouse themselves in giant warehouses, some of which they move to customers directly from their suppliers. But there must be something here that Walmart, which when you think of it is just a set of warehouses, does not have. If you look at Walmart and you see that a Walmart warehouse in the United States is, I think, for 95% of Americans, if I recall the statistic, within a 15-minute drive. So 95% of Americans are within 15 minutes of what really, we call it a store, but it's really a warehouse. If you look at it in an Amazon-type topology, they don't have this problem. And one of the reasons is that they are renowned for having a massive AIP, ERP, I should say, structure. I like to call Walmart a set of stores stuck on a server. That really got us thinking deeper about the fundamental model here. Because if you look at working capital for centuries and centuries and centuries, you can go back to a Mediterranean trade during the Roman Empire, the Greeks, wherever you want to go. The biggest problem merchants had was managing inventories, receivables, and using payables to deal with it. And that's how we evolved things like letters of credit in the medieval period. And so the whole structure of industry has been focused on these very complicated working capital management data. But it was Walmart that began to use working capital as a measure of the velocity of its velocity of information, which allowed it to turn its inventory at superior speeds so that it could put more goods on the shelf in its stores and have less in the back room, in the warehousing space in its stores. And if I remember rightly, because it's a long time ago, Walmart became the first company to get to something, it was some astonishing number, like 10% of the space in every store was warehousing. And traditionally in other stores it was more like 25 or 30%. There was some number like that. So Walmart was the one that got us thinking. And then when Apple came along and was suffering badly, and suddenly we noticed that when Tim Cook arrived, the data took a Walmart turn around 97, 98. And both companies just took off. Walmart's now the biggest company in the world, and Apple was the first to hit $1 trillion in value. So the model is interesting in that respect. Any more questions?
Yeah, Francis, I have a question, and I think it's actually a question that a lot of people may have on the forefront of their mind. And it has to do essentially with the information velocity and your first slide that you explained. Now, typically, what I would say is if I have accounts receivable, if I have inventory, and I have a huge number of accounts payable against this, it's actually positive from a cash flow point of view. Accounts receivable is negative, inventory is negative, but a big accounts payable is actually financing my activity. And this is kind of what we learn in business school, ultimately. You take a very different stand on it because you're saying, wait a moment, if your supply chain is essentially out there 100 plus days, as we have seen earlier on one of your slides earlier, it's actually not all positive. And this has to do a lot with how smooth and digital is your system running in the background. I would like you to probably give a little bit more flavor to this for all participants that are on the call.
Yeah, this is a fascinating question. And it is something that I don't think a lot of people anticipated, because the fact is that in business school, this is exactly as you describe it, how it is taught. And this is a standard way of thinking. It goes back as far as the creation of double entry accounting I think it was the early 16th century in Florence, I think. And if you look at tradition and the way of thinking of this is absolutely the way people think. What I realized when I looked at Walmart's data was that Walmart was getting an information premium by thinking this through differently, as was Apple. And some of the results of being able to think this through differently and to look at these numbers as indicators of speed become really interesting. There was a major hurricane some years ago in New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina. And Walmart has attached to its operations giant weather stations all over its serving area. And it monitors the weather. And then before a storm or something else, a drought or whatever hits, it loads up its stores with what the data tell it that its customers want. So everybody knows that if in a certain area, part of the country, let's say, where people in a disaster prefer to drink water, there's water in the stores. If they're big fans of soda, Coke, whatever, there's Coke in the stores. Whatever it is that the information system tells Walmart that people want, that information then turns into anticipating and preparing its stores before the event hits. When Katrina came along, Walmart decided to do something to improve its public image, not unnaturally, and sent truckloads and truckloads of goods to New Orleans that were exactly the goods it knew the people in New Orleans would want in such a circumstance. The gigantic truck trains going down to New Orleans had to be turned back by the federal authorities, FEMA, because the federal authorities didn't have a system powerful enough for absorbing all of the food and supplies that the people in New Orleans would want and that Walmart knew in advance. Now, when I work with companies that don't have these systems in place and do look at payables in the traditional sense, I find almost inevitably a massive customer information deficit. I find they don't know a lot about their customers. Often, if you go into their R&D labs, and this is where it gets fascinating, and you start to look at the R&D programs, they're almost in isolation. I call them guesswork. So you have people in the labs guessing at what customers want. Apple, by contrast, would do very little guessing because the real-time flow of information through its information velocity management is such that it has this huge profit-generating information base, which overwhelms other considerations in their way of thinking. And this is I think it's almost like a break. You know, in Europe, you had the Gutenberg press. People were still writing, if you like, in 1440. But once they started printing the same things that they wrote, everything changed. And it may sound a bit abstract, look at working capital management this way, but I think that our position on with really low-cost, high-velocity information today is allowing us to look at data differently than we did before and reach radically different conclusions. So I'm kind of thinking, well, yeah, that's what everyone is taught in business school and what accountants are all taught and so on. But the information today, because of our IT potential, is showing us a very different track.
Yeah, and I think what was for me a key revelation from your explanations was that the more digitized we are in our firms, the more important is information velocity. And if we actually believe that we can digitize our companies through mergers or acquisitions, then information velocity starts to take a key element or key position in actually looking at specific targets. Because if we do it the Apple way, as you describe it, the moment I buy my iPhone XS Max in a store in Cologne, what essentially gets known throughout the entire Apple universe, I need to say, not just Apple's headquarters or European headquarters or wherever. No, it gets all the way down to the latest supply chain element in the entire company, that one Apple iPhone XS Max is gone and that it needs to be replaced. And I think this is actually where a lot of the real charm is coming in and where the value is coming in ultimately.
Yeah, one of the things that Apple has done too, by acquiring this staggering amount of information so far ahead of the market, as I mentioned earlier, it's allowed them to accrue operating profits completely out of proportion to their actual market share. But another thing it does is it allows them to design products ahead of the market and see from what they're doing what kind of parts they will need well into the future. And Apple has been known to use its information velocity strength to prepay up to a year or more in advance for strategic products, parts, processors, memory, stuff like that. I was in to see some years ago now the then CEO of Alcatel in London. And he and I were sitting together, and he complained to me that they were having real problems getting strategic parts. And the reason was that Apple had already locked up the market. Now, what had happened was that Alcatel's information velocity was very slow. So it was responding after the fact, after a product was designed, after product line management had taken it on and so on, then let's order the parts. Well, by then, Apple had known probably for a good 2 or 3 years what parts it would need, had locked up the supply. And then when Alcatel went out to market to buy these things, there was no supply, which then put Alcatel on the back foot. It then had to wait way out of its plan for another couple of years before it could get the parts, and the supply chain could gear up for the additional demand. And we all know what happened to Alcatel-Lucent. It doesn't exist anymore. The impact of this data on comparing, in this case, strategies and options for companies that are quite unalike. Alcatel-Lucent wasn't really in the same business as Apple, but there were certain kinds of processors that were required by both, but Apple's information velocity allowed it to get there first, locked up the supply. Alcatel-Lucent locked out, lost market share as a result, with key customers, and before too long, it had to sell itself. So, and the CEO lost his job within a pretty short time after that. So this is a kind of thing that when we look at it, we begin to realize the implications are really massive.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, any more questions?
Francis, one more question. How can it be Amazon is one of the most valuable companies in the world, even if the information velocity is so slow? How can you explain this?
You know what? I don't. I don't. I just don't. I look at this and I say, sell, sell. These data do not tell me to buy that stock.
Okay.
These data say to me, now, the opportunity, I think it would be interesting if they divested AWS. Now, if they divested AWS, which they won't, because that's 106% of their operating profits, then I'd look at AWS. But I just look at these data and I say, why would anyone buy this? I don't get it. And I'm not a stock picker. Like I'm not in the market. I don't advise people on what to buy and sell in the share business. This to me, this is a sell sign, huge sell sign. Mm-hmm. And the information is public. This is not private, secret information. That you need Cambridge Analytica to get out of your data set.
Yeah, very good. Okay, any more questions? Well, Francis, I think you had thought about a special gift as well as we have, so I'll let you go first.
Yes, here's what I have. We have our Future Creator rules, and there are 260 or so of them. In the M&A rule set, I think there are 18 M&A rules. And what we are going to do is put those M&A rules together, and we will send them to Thomas and Gunther, and they can send them out to all the participants as kind of a thank you for participating in the seminar.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you very, very much for that generosity. And Gunther and I will add to that. We've developed a short video on the 7 deadly sins of M&A deal making, and we'll put a link into the email so that you can register for that if you want to. Well, Francis, let me again say thank you very, very much for this great webcast and all the insights into this. I really highly appreciate your time and also appreciate everyone's time that actually joined us here today for the last hour. Really appreciate your time, and stay in touch. We definitely, Gunther and I are definitely going to provide more of this content. And Francis, really thank you very, very much for your insights. And clearly, you are a very special person in the finance world, and was extremely interesting to listen to your story about Amazon and Whole Foods. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you very much too. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Goodbye now.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.